Chapter 1. Winter's Return. The cold air of December settled over the town like a quiet whisper, soft and unrelenting. Snow blanketed the rooftops, shimmering under the pale glow of the streetlights. The streets, once bustling with shoppers preparing for the holidays, were now still as night settled in, leaving behind a serene silence that only winter could bring. Beneath the thick layer of snow, the town's cobblestone paths felt like an ancient memory, solid and unmoving, as if they held the secrets of years gone by. Amid this stillness, Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the small town she had left so many years ago. It had been 10 years since she had last stepped foot here, 10 years since she had looked back on a chapter of her life that felt unfinished. The years in between had been a blur of responsibilities, growth, and the inevitable drift that came with time. But something had called her back. Perhaps it was the holiday spirit. Maybe it was the pull of nostalgia. Whatever it was, the familiar chill of winter tugged at something deep within her, as though the snow itself remembered her. She stood at the edge of the town square, watching as the lights from the large Christmas tree in the center flickered against the twilight. The decorations were much like they had been when she was younger. Twinkling lights wrapped around evergreens, wreaths hung on every door, and the soft glow of candles peeking through windows. Yet there was a difference in her now, a weight in her chest that hadn't been there when she was 16. It was the weight of time, of choices made, and of a love that had never truly left her heart. As she gazed at the tree, her mind wandered back to that one fateful Christmas when everything had changed. They had been 16 then, just children standing on the edge of something neither of them had fully understood. She had loved him deeply, with the innocent certainty that only youth could provide. But life, as it often does, had other plans. His name lingered on the edges of her thoughts, Daniel. Even after all these years, she could still recall every detail of him. His dark hair had always fallen messily across his forehead. His eyes had been a shade of blue that seemed to shift with the seasons, and his smile had always held a quiet warmth that had made her feel seen. They had been best friends, inseparable in the way that only childhood bonds could create. They had shared everything: hopes, dreams, fears, and in the quiet moments of winter, they had shared their hearts. But when the time had come to take that step beyond friendship, he had gently pulled away. She remembered the way he had looked at her that night, beneath the Christmas tree, his expression full of love and regret. He had cared for her deeply, but his reasons for saying no had been rooted in something larger than either of them. His family had been going through hardships, and Daniel, ever the protector, had refused to allow her to be tied to the difficulties he faced. He had wanted her to be free, to live a life unburdened by his struggles. That decision had shaped the course of their lives. Elizabeth had left the small town not long after, pursuing her dreams elsewhere, leaving behind the boy she had loved and the home they had both known. She had moved on, or at least she had tried to. But now, standing in the heart of the town that had once been the center of her world, it all came flooding back. The snow began to fall again, tiny flakes drifting lazily from the sky, settling on her hair and shoulders. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her eyes, once fixed on the Christmas tree, slowly shifted toward the old cafe across the square. It was there that they had spent so many afternoons together, laughing, dreaming, and planning for a future that had never come to pass. The building looked much the same, its windows fogged from the warmth inside, the soft glow of lights spilling out onto the snow-covered street. Without thinking, Elizabeth began to walk. Her boots crunched against the snow with each step, the sound the only thing breaking the stillness of the night. As she approached the cafe, memories flooded her mind. Daniel's laugh, the way he used to trace patterns on the fogged glass with his finger, the warmth of his hand brushing against hers beneath the table. It had been a lifetime ago, but the memories felt as vivid as if they had happened just yesterday. She stopped in front of the window, peering inside. The cafe was almost empty now, save for a few late-night customers nursing cups of coffee and watching the snowfall. Her heart ached with the weight of time, of what could have been. But before she could turn away, something caught her eye. Someone. Sitting alone at a corner table, bathed in the soft glow of the cafe's lights, was a man. His head was bent slightly, as though lost in thought, and his hands were wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. But there was something unmistakable about him, something that stirred a long-buried recognition in her heart. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind raced to piece it together. It was him, Daniel. The years had changed him, of course. His features were sharper now, more defined, and his hair was tinged with the first signs of gray. But it was him. There was no mistaking the familiar tilt of his head, the way he held himself, the quiet calm that had always surrounded him. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of emotions rushing through her all at once: joy, fear, longing. She had thought of this moment countless times, wondered what it would be like to see him again, to stand in the same space as him after all these years. But now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to do. For a moment, she hesitated. Part of her wanted to turn away, to leave the past where it belonged and walk away from the memories that still had the power to hurt. But another part of her, the part that had never truly let go, urged her to stay. The snow continued to fall, a silent witness to the unfolding moment. She took a deep breath and, with her heart in her throat, pushed open the door of the cafe. The bell above the door jingled softly, and as she stepped inside, the warmth enveloped her, bringing with it the scent of coffee and pastries. Daniel didn't notice her at first. He remained lost in his thoughts, staring out the window at the falling snow. But then, as though sensing her presence, he slowly looked up. Their eyes met, and in that single, fleeting moment, everything changed. Chapter 2: A Christmas Memory. The snowfall outside grew heavier, draping the town in an ever-deepening veil of white, as though nature itself was determined to erase the world and create something new. Inside the cafe, the quiet hum of the heater and the clinking of silverware against porcelain added to the feeling of warmth. But for Elizabeth, time seemed to stand still. She stood just inside the doorway, her eyes locked with Daniel's, and the noise of the cafe faded into a distant blur. The years between them, all 10 of them, seemed to dissolve in that moment. His gaze held the same steady warmth she had known as a girl, and yet it was different, older, more thoughtful, marked by time. She could see the faint lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the hint of weariness in his posture, and she wondered if he could see the same changes in her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as if they were suspended between the past and the present, caught in the delicate balance of memories and the unknown. But then, ever so slowly, Daniel's expression shifted. His eyes softened with a quiet recognition, a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that Elizabeth had not felt in years. Without thinking, her feet carried her toward him. She moved slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she closed the distance between them. The cafe felt warmer, cozier, as she walked through the familiar space. Everything seemed as she remembered it. The dark wooden tables, the soft glow of the lights, the scent of freshly baked pastries that filled the air. But there was something different now, an almost tangible weight of anticipation that made this space feel smaller, more intimate. Daniel's eyes followed her as she approached, never breaking contact, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. When she reached his table, Elizabeth hesitated for only a second before slipping into the seat across from him, the wood of the chair cool beneath her fingers. She set her hands in her lap, her fingers twisting together nervously, but she could feel the warmth of Daniel's gaze on her. For the first time in a decade, they sat across from each other, separated by a small wooden table, and yet it felt as though they were standing on the edge of something much larger. something that had begun all those years ago and had been left unfinished. Elizabeth's eyes traced his face, lingering on the familiar curve of his jaw. The way his hair still fell into his eyes the same way it had when they were teenagers. He had changed, of course. The boy she had known was now a man, and the years had added a quiet strength to his features. Yet, beneath it all, she could still see glimpses of the Daniel she had loved, and never truly stopped loving. Her mind began to wander, drifting back to that Christmas when everything had changed. The memories came rushing in, vivid and bittersweet. It had been a cold December evening, much like this one. She remembered the way the snow had fallen in thick, swirling flurries, and how the streets had sparkled with holiday lights. They had been inseparable then, she and Daniel, always side by side. That Christmas, they had spent nearly every moment together, laughing, teasing, dreaming about the future. There had been a lightness to their friendship, a sense of infinite possibility, and for Elizabeth, it had felt like the most natural thing in the world for their friendship to blossom into something more. She had known she loved him. She had felt it in every glance, in every shared laugh, in every quiet moment they had stolen together. And she had believed, with the certainty only the young possess, that he had felt the same. That night, they had stood together beneath the large Christmas tree in the town square, just like tonight. The snow had fallen gently around them, and the air had been filled with the scent of pine and the warmth of holiday cheer. Elizabeth could still remember how her heart had raced as she had gathered the courage to tell him how she felt. But when she had finally spoken the words, when she had let her heart spill out in the quiet cold of that winter night, Daniel had looked at her with an expression she would never forget. His eyes had been full of sadness and something else she hadn't understood then, something that felt like a quiet, impossible burden. He had taken her hands in his touch warm even in the cold, and he had gently told her no. Even now, sitting across from him, Elizabeth could still feel the sting of that moment. The pain of his refusal had stayed with her for years, a dull ache that never truly went away. She hadn't understood at the time. She had thought it was because he didn't feel the same, that somehow she had misread the signals between them. It wasn't until much later, after she had left town, that she had learned the truth. Daniel had refused her not because he didn't love her, but because his life had been falling apart. His family had been going through financial ruin, and his father had been struggling with illness. He had been trying to protect her, to keep her from being dragged down by the weight of his troubles. He had loved her enough to let her go. Elizabeth had learned this too late, after she had already left for college, after she had built a life far away from the small town and the boy she had loved. And by then, the distance between them had grown too vast to cross. Now, sitting here in the cafe, with the years of separation stretched between them, she wondered what might have been different if she had stayed, if she had known the truth earlier. Would they have found a way to be together? Or had it been fate that had pulled them apart, only to bring them back together now? The sound of a spoon clinking against a coffee cup broke the quiet of the cafe, and Elizabeth blinked, pulling herself out of the past. Daniel was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. The weight of their shared history hung between them, unspoken but deeply felt. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the cup of tea that had been set in front of her by the waitress, though she couldn't remember ordering it. The warmth seeped into her fingers, grounding her in the present, even as her thoughts continued to drift. So much time had passed. So much had changed. And yet, sitting here with Daniel, it felt as though the past was still alive, still waiting to be resolved. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and soft, covering the world in a blanket of white. Christmas was only days away, and with it came the promise of new beginnings. The cafe's soft lights glowed against the darkness, casting a gentle light over their faces. In that quiet space, surrounded by the warmth of the cafe and the weight of their memories, Elizabeth felt something stir in her chest, a flicker of hope, tentative and fragile. The past had been painful, yes, but perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps there was still a chance for them, a chance to find what had been lost all those years ago. The snow outside swirled in gentle patterns, and as Elizabeth sat across from Daniel, she let herself believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the magic of Christmas could bring them together once more. Chapter 3. Familiar Faces, Distant Hearts. The days inched closer to Christmas, the town swelling with festive cheer. The streets filled with holiday shoppers, parents pulling bundled-up children through the snow, and carolers whose songs floated through the crisp winter air. The glow of holiday lights reflected off the snow-covered ground, casting soft hues of red, green, and gold onto the old stone buildings. Elizabeth found herself wandering those streets the following day, her thoughts still lingering on the meeting with Daniel. It had been a brief encounter, filled with a heavy silence and the weight of their shared history. After sitting in the cafe together, they had parted without a word, just as quietly as they had come together. It wasn't awkward, but it wasn't comfortable either. Their connection, once so natural, now felt tentative, like walking across thin ice, unsure of where to step next. Her boots crunched over the snow as she walked aimlessly through the town. The cold air bit at her cheeks, the wind threading its fingers through her scarf, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying memories she had thought were buried beneath years of distance and distractions. The small town seemed unchanged, frozen in time since she had left all those years ago. She passed the bookshop where she and Daniel used to spend hours browsing the shelves, lost in their shared love of stories. The windows were decorated with wreaths and garlands, the warm glow of the interior inviting against the winter chill. She could almost see her younger self inside, laughing with Daniel over some old, dusty novel they had unearthed. Those memories felt like ghosts now, haunting her in the quiet moments when she let her guard down. She had come back to this town, perhaps unconsciously, seeking closure. For years, she had pushed thoughts of Daniel to the back of her mind, trying to focus on her career, on new friendships, on life far away from this small, snow-covered corner of the world. But now, with Christmas approaching and the town cloaked in the same magic it had all those years ago, she couldn't escape the pull of the past. As she walked, Elizabeth found herself drawn toward a small park on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, nestled between the woods and the outskirts, with a frozen pond in the center where children often skated. She had spent many winter afternoons there with Daniel, skating across the ice and building snow forts until their fingers were numb from the cold. It had been their sanctuary, a place where the rest of the world seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them and the quiet beauty of winter. The park was mostly empty now, save for a few children bundled in bright jackets and scarves, their laughter ringing through the still air. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the pond, watching them skate, her breath forming soft clouds in front of her as it mingled with the cold. The surface of the ice glistened under the soft sunlight, smooth and unbroken, except for the scuffs left by skates. It reminded her of the day, years ago, when she and Daniel had fallen on that very ice, tangled in laughter and snow. She could still feel the way her cheeks had burned from the cold, the way her heart had swelled with warmth in his presence. It was on this very ice, she remembered, where she had first realized she loved him. It had been a simple moment, nothing particularly grand. They had been skating in circles, laughing and teasing each other as they often did. When she had stumbled and fallen, Daniel had reached out to help her up, and as his fingers wrapped around hers, something had shifted inside her. In that fleeting moment, amidst the laughter and the cold, she had seen him not just as her best friend, but as something more. That realization had terrified her then. It had been new, strange, and overwhelming. But at the same time, it had felt inevitable, as though every step they had taken in their friendship had been leading toward that one undeniable truth. She loved him. Deeply, unconditionally. Elizabeth closed her eyes now, letting the memory wash over her. She could still feel the coolness of his hand in hers, the way his laugh had echoed in the still air, filling her with a warmth that no winter chill could touch. It was a memory she had kept close to her heart for years, even after everything had fallen apart. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a figure on the far side of the pond. He stood alone, watching the skaters with a distant expression, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. It took only a moment for her to recognize him, even from across the frozen pond. Daniel. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as her eyes settled on him. He looked different in the daylight, his features clearer, the lines of age and experience more evident. His dark hair was speckled with snowflakes, and he wore a thick coat that looked too big for his lean frame. But it was his posture that struck her the most. The way he stood so still, almost as if he were rooted in place, lost in thought, or perhaps lost in the same memories that were swirling through her mind. She wondered what he was thinking. Did he remember the times they had spent here, skating and laughing as though they had all the time in the world? Or had those memories faded for him, buried beneath the years of life that had come between them? A sudden, irrational urge tugged at her, urging her to cross the ice, to go to him. But she hesitated, her feet frozen in place. What would she say? What could she say after all this time? The memories between them were bittersweet, tainted by the pain of what could have been but never was. For a few long moments, she stood there, watching him from a distance, unsure of what to do. The snow fell softly around them, creating a serene, almost magical backdrop to the quiet moment. And as she watched him, Elizabeth felt a pang of longing, not just for Daniel, but for the simplicity of the past, for the innocence of those days when they had believed that love alone was enough to make everything right. But it wasn't enough. She had learned that the hard way. Just as she was about to turn and walk away, Daniel shifted. His gaze, once fixed on the skaters, drifted across the ice until it landed on her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. His eyes widened ever so slightly, and for a moment, Elizabeth saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, surprise, and perhaps even a hint of the same longing she felt. The connection between them, once so strong, now felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin over the years. Yet, even from across the pond, she could feel it. The pull of their shared past, the weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them. Elizabeth's breath hitched in her throat as she stood there, waiting for some kind of sign, for some indication of what to do next. But Daniel didn't move. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, as though he, too, was caught between the past and the present, unsure of how to navigate the distance between them. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, slowly, Daniel turned away. He walked toward the edge of the park, his figure growing smaller with each step, until he disappeared behind the trees, leaving Elizabeth standing alone by the pond. The ache in her chest deepened as she watched him go. There had been a time when she would have followed him without hesitation, when she would have chased after him and demanded answers, demanded to understand why they had drifted so far apart. But now, after all these years, she wasn't sure if she had the strength to do that again. She remained by the pond for a while longer, watching the snow fall gently over the frozen surface. The children's laughter echoed faintly in the background, but it felt distant, like the sound of another world entirely. As the day grew colder and the light began to fade, Elizabeth finally turned and walked away, leaving the memories of the past behind her, at least for now. But as she made her way back through the quiet streets of the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that her story with Daniel was far from over. The weight of the unspoken still hung between them, like the first snowflake in a storm, fragile yet inevitable, waiting for the right moment to fall. Chapter 4. The Echo of Old Dreams. Elizabeth sat by the window of her childhood bedroom, the soft light of a late afternoon slipping through the frost-covered glass. Outside, the world was blanketed in white, the snow shimmering under the golden glow of the setting sun. It was quiet, too quiet, almost broken only by the occasional gust of wind and the distant sound of a snowplow clearing the roads. Inside, the house was warm, its familiar corners draped in festive garlands, the scent of pine and cinnamon still lingering from the Christmas decorations her mother had put up earlier in the week. The room felt almost unchanged since the last time she had slept there. The same faded posters hung on the walls, remnants of her teenage years. Her bookshelf was still crowded with the novels she had devoured during long winter nights, stories that had once been her escape from the small world of this town. The only difference now was the thin layer of dust that had settled over the spines, a testament to the time that had passed since she had last lived here. Elizabeth pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she stared out into the winter landscape. Her mind was a tangle of thoughts, memories pressing against the edges of her consciousness, demanding attention. She couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about their chance encounter at the cafe, about seeing him again at the pond. Each moment had felt like a ripple in the fabric of her carefully constructed life, as though the past had come surging back with a force she hadn't expected. It wasn't as though she hadn't thought of him over the years. He had never been far from her mind, even when she was miles away, building a life of her own in the city. But there had been a comfort in the distance, a safety in knowing that their paths weren't likely to cross again. She had believed that time and space would be enough to dull the ache of what they had shared, to smooth over the rough edges of her memories until they became nothing more than a gentle nostalgia. But seeing him again had shattered that illusion. The feelings she had buried deep within herself had come rushing back, raw and vivid, as though no time had passed at all. She had thought she was over him, thought she had moved on, and yet, all it had taken was one look, one shared glance across a frozen pond, for everything to unravel. She let out a quiet sigh, her breath fogging the glass as she leaned her forehead against the cold window pane. Outside, the snow continued to fall, softly and steadily, each flake drifting down like a whisper from the sky. It reminded her of the Christmases they had spent together, when the world had felt so small and yet so full of promise. There had been a time, long ago, when she had believed they would end up together. She had imagined a future with Daniel, one filled with laughter and shared dreams, where the two of them would always be side by side, no matter what challenges came their way. They had been so close, so impossibly close to that future. But then everything had changed. Elizabeth's mind wandered back to that winter night, 10 years ago, when they had stood beneath the Christmas tree in the town square. She had been so sure of herself then, so sure of her feelings for him. The weight of her love had felt too heavy to keep hidden any longer, and so she had taken the risk, had laid her heart bare in the hope that he would meet her halfway. But he hadn't. Instead, he had gently pulled away, his refusal soft but firm, his words leaving her with an ache she hadn't understood at the time. He hadn't given her a real explanation, hadn't told her about the troubles his family was facing, or the weight he was carrying on his own shoulders. He had simply said no, and in that moment, Elizabeth had felt her world shift. After that night, everything between them had changed. The easy closeness they had once shared had become strained, their laughter tinged with something heavier. They had drifted apart slowly, inevitably, as though they were two ships caught in the same current, pulling away from each other despite the bond that still connected them. And then, after graduation, she had left. It had been easier to go than to stay in a place that reminded her of what could never be. She had thrown herself into her studies, into her career, building a life for herself that had nothing to do with the town she had grown up in, nothing to do with the boy she had loved. Yet now, after all these years, here she was back in the same room, in the same town, with the same feelings bubbling up inside her. And Daniel was still here too, his presence as steady and constant as the snowfall outside. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the small, framed photograph sitting on her nightstand. It was an old picture, taken when they were both 16. In it, she and Daniel stood side by side, grinning like idiots, their arms draped over each other's shoulders. It had been taken during the summer, just after they had finished a long hike up to a lookout point outside of town. Their faces were flushed with exertion, their clothes rumpled, but the happiness in their expressions was undeniable. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly over the frame, tracing the outline of their younger selves. They had been so carefree then, so full of hope for the future. It was hard to reconcile that version of herself with the woman she had become, someone who had learned the hard way that life didn't always turn out the way you wanted it to. But even as she sat there, surrounded by the relics of her past, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished lingered between them, something that had been left unresolved for too long. She wondered what Daniel thought about it all. Did he regret the way things had ended? Did he ever think about the path they could have taken if things had been different? Or had he moved on completely, leaving their shared history behind him without a second thought? It was strange to think that someone she had once known so intimately could now feel like a stranger. They had been through so much together, shared so many moments of laughter and joy, but now, after all this time. It was as if they were standing on opposite sides of a vast chasm, unsure of how to bridge the gap. And yet, despite the distance between them, Elizabeth couldn't deny the pull she still felt toward him. It was as though something in the universe was drawing them back together, whether she was ready for it or not. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. As the light outside began to fade, casting long shadows across the snow, Elizabeth stood up from the window and moved toward the closet. She pulled out an old coat and scarf, the familiar weight of the fabric grounding her in the present. She needed to clear her head, to breathe in the crisp winter air and escape the confines of the house, if only for a little while. Stepping outside, she was immediately greeted by the cold, the sharp bite of the wind against her cheeks. But she welcomed it, letting the chill seep into her bones as she made her way down the familiar streets. The town was quiet now, most people having retreated indoors to escape the cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of her boots in the snow and the occasional creak of branches weighed down by ice. As she walked, Elizabeth's thoughts continued to swirl. She tried to push Daniel from her mind, but it was impossible. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of him, of the life they had shared in this town, and the life they had almost shared. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, and the faint smell of wood smoke filled the air. It was Christmas, and yet, for the first time in years, Elizabeth didn't feel the usual excitement that the season brought. Instead, she felt something else, something deeper and more complicated. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of the town square, where the large Christmas tree stood, its branches heavy with ornaments and lights. The same tree where, years ago, she had confessed her love to Daniel, only to have her heart quietly broken. Elizabeth stood there for a long time, staring up at the tree, the memories of that night flooding her mind. She could almost see her younger self standing beneath the branches, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. She had been so sure of herself then, so certain that love would be enough to fix everything. But life wasn't that simple. Love, as she had learned, wasn't always enough. And yet, as she stood there in the quiet of the evening, with the snow falling gently around her and the lights of the Christmas tree reflecting in her eyes, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to rewrite the ending of their story. Because if there was one thing she had learned in all her years away, it was that some connections were too strong to break. And maybe, just maybe, Daniel felt the same. As she turned to head back home, the weight of her thoughts still heavy on her shoulders, she couldn't shake the feeling that this Christmas would be different. Something was coming. Something she couldn't yet name but felt deep in her bones. The past, it seemed, wasn't finished with her yet. Chapter 5. A Town of Secrets. The town had settled into a tranquil rhythm, its streets blanketed in a deep layer of snow, soft as down. The houses were wrapped in strings of colored lights, their windows glowing with the warmth of hearths inside. The townspeople moved slowly through the days leading up to Christmas, their routines draped in a layer of nostalgia. Every corner, every shop window seemed to whisper stories from years long gone. Stories that Elizabeth had thought she had left behind when she left for the city. But here she was again, walking through those familiar streets, every step pulling her deeper into memories she wasn't sure she wanted to relive. She had returned to this place out of a sense of duty, wanting to spend Christmas with her family, but now it felt as though she was retracing her steps back to a time she wasn't sure she could handle. The town, in all its coziness and festive spirit, had become a landscape of the past, haunted by the echo of the life she had once known. Elizabeth passed the old library, its stone facade dusted with snow. She had spent so many afternoons here as a teenager, tucked into the corners of the dimly lit reading rooms, losing herself in books to escape the unease she felt around her feelings for Daniel. Back then, the library had been a sanctuary from the confusion of growing up, from the complexities of love that had suddenly seemed to tangle themselves into everything. As she walked past now, she could almost see her younger self there, hunched over a novel, her mind trying to make sense of emotions she had been too young to fully grasp. The love she had felt for Daniel had been simple in its purity, yet complicated by the unspoken truths they never seemed able to share. The air was crisp and sharp, the cold biting at her skin even through her scarf and coat. Her breath rose in soft clouds, mingling with the falling snow, and the silence of the streets enveloped her. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since she had seen him at the pond, and the weight of that encounter still sat heavily on her chest. Seeing him again had stirred something inside her, a mixture of longing and regret, of hope and fear. Elizabeth continued walking, her path taking her toward the old bridge that spanned the narrow river at the edge of town. It was a place she hadn't been to in years, yet her feet carried her there as though drawn by some invisible force. The bridge was worn now, its wood weathered by time and the elements, but still standing strong against the steady flow of the river below. She stopped halfway across, leaning against the railing to look down at the water. The river wasn't frozen yet, but the surface was thick with patches of ice, the current moving sluggishly beneath. The soft murmur of the water was the only sound that broke the stillness, and Elizabeth found herself lost in the rhythm of it, letting her thoughts drift along with the flow. It was here, on this very bridge, that she and Daniel had once spent an entire afternoon, talking about everything and nothing. They had been 15 then, still young and full of the boundless optimism that only youth could bring. She remembered the way the sun had set that day, casting a golden light over the water, the warmth of it contrasting with the cool breeze that had made her shiver. Daniel had noticed, of course, and without hesitation, he had given her his jacket, draping it over her shoulders with a grin that had made her heart skip. It had been one of those perfect moments where the world seemed to pause and everything had felt right. But now, as she stood there, years later, that memory felt distant, like a dream she could no longer fully grasp. Time had eroded the edges of it, leaving behind only fragments. His smile, the feel of the worn fabric of his jacket, the sound of the river below them. So much had changed since then. They had changed. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Elizabeth turned away from the river and continued walking. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but her feet seemed to know, carrying her further from the town center, away from the houses and the decorations, toward the outskirts. The road leading out of town was quieter here, the snow undisturbed by cars or people. The fields on either side stretched out, their rolling hills covered in a thick blanket of white. It was beautiful, in a stark, lonely way, and Elizabeth felt a strange sense of peace settle over her as she walked. Here, away from the town, away from the memories that seemed to cling to every corner, she could finally breathe. She reached the top of a small hill, and for a moment, she simply stood there, looking out at the horizon. The sky was a soft blend of pink and gold, the last light of the day fading into the darkness of the coming night. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of the forest, its trees standing tall and silent against the sky. It was the same forest where she and Daniel had once hiked, exploring the trails and getting lost in the maze of trees. They had spent entire summers there, their days filled with adventure and discovery, their nights spent lying on the grass, staring up at the stars. Those had been the days when the future had seemed wide open, full of possibilities. But that future had never come. Life had taken them in different directions, pulling them apart even when they had tried to hold on. And now, standing there on the edge of the town, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder what could have been. What if she had stayed? What if they had fought harder for each other, instead of letting circumstances dictate their fate? The wind picked up, swirling the snow around her in soft, dancing flurries. It was a reminder of the present, of the reality she was living now. She couldn't change the past, no matter how much she might want to. And yet, the past seemed to be calling to her, pulling her back to a time when everything had felt simpler, when love had seemed like enough. Elizabeth shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her as she turned to head back to town. The walk was long, the cold biting at her as the night settled in, but she didn't mind. It gave her time to think, to sort through the tangled web of emotions that had been stirred up since her return. By the time she reached the familiar streets of the town, the sky had darkened, and the Christmas lights twinkled in the windows, casting a soft glow over the snow. It was peaceful here, in a way that felt almost surreal after the whirlwind of thoughts that had consumed her. As she approached her parents' house, She noticed the flicker of a light on the porch and smiled softly to herself. Her mother had always been one to keep the porch light on, even when no one was expected. It was a habit that Elizabeth had always found comforting, a small sign that home was always there, waiting for her. She climbed the steps, brushing the snow from her boots before stepping inside. The warmth of the house enveloped her, the scent of pine and gingerbread filling the air. It was a scene straight out of a Christmas card, but instead of bringing her comfort, it only made the emptiness inside her feel more profound. Elizabeth went upstairs to her room, shedding her coat and scarf as she entered. The window was still frosted over, the outside world a blur of snow and darkness. She sat on the edge of her bed, her gaze drifting to the photograph on her nightstand once more. Daniel's smiling face stared back at her, a reminder of the life they had once shared, the life that had slipped through their fingers. She had spent so long trying to move on from him, trying to forget the way her heart had ached when he had said they couldn't be together. But now, seeing him again, all those old feelings had come rushing back, stronger than ever. Elizabeth wasn't sure what to do with them, wasn't sure if there was any point in trying to reach out to him again. Maybe it was too late. Maybe they had both changed too much. But there was something deep inside her that couldn't let go of the hope that their story wasn't finished yet. As she lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the years between them seemed to press down on her. But in the quiet of the night, with the soft glow of the Christmas lights filtering in through the window, Elizabeth made a decision. She wasn't ready to give up on Daniel. Not yet. The past, it seemed, was still very much a part of her present. And perhaps, if she was brave enough, it could be a part of her future as well. Chapter 6. Winter's Pull. The early morning sun barely crept over the horizon, casting a pale light across the snow-covered town. It was a new day, crisp and cold, but Elizabeth's mind was still trapped in the weight of yesterday's reflections. She had barely slept, tossing and turning in her childhood bed, her thoughts circling endlessly around Daniel and the unresolved emotions between them. Now, standing in the kitchen, she sipped her coffee slowly, the warmth seeping through the mug into her hands. Her parents had already left for the day, her mother bustling off to her morning church meeting, her father out running errands. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors and the soft hum of the heater. The Christmas tree stood tall in the living room, its lights twinkling faintly, casting shadows on the walls. Elizabeth stared out the window, watching as the world slowly awakened outside. The snow had fallen steadily throughout the night, leaving the streets and rooftops buried in a fresh, untouched layer of white. It was the kind of morning she used to love as a child. When the town was quiet, the world outside blanketed in stillness, as if time itself had paused to allow the snow to fall. But today, the beauty of the scene felt hollow. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest, a feeling of something unfinished, something waiting just beyond her reach. Seeing Daniel again had stirred up too much, and now, the comfortable distance she had built between her past and present was crumbling. She wasn't sure what to do with these feelings. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to think about him, to really confront the emotions she had buried deep inside. And yet, here she was, standing in her childhood home, her mind full of memories she had tried so hard to forget. Setting her coffee down on the counter, Elizabeth grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and stepped outside into the cold. The air hit her sharply, biting at her cheeks, but she welcomed the sting. She needed the clarity that the winter air brought, needed to clear her head and find some sense of direction. The streets were quiet as she walked, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. A few early risers were out shoveling their driveways, their breath rising in white clouds as they worked. But for the most part, the town still felt asleep. The houses were decorated in twinkling lights, wreaths hanging on front doors, but the festive atmosphere felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. As she wandered through the familiar streets, Elizabeth found herself drawn back to the same places she had visited yesterday. The library, the old bridge, the town square. It was as if her feet knew where to go, even if her mind hadn't made the decision yet. Eventually, she found herself standing in front of a small, familiar building on the outskirts of town. The community center, where she and Daniel had spent so many afternoons during their teenage years. It looked almost exactly the same as it had a decade ago. Its brick facade dusted with snow, the windows fogged from the heat inside. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat as memories flooded back. This place held so many pieces of their shared history, so many moments that had shaped who they were. It had been their refuge from the world, a place where they could escape the pressures of school and family, where they could simply be themselves. She stepped closer, her boots sinking into the snow as she made her way to the entrance. The door creaked softly as she pushed it open, and the warmth inside enveloped her immediately, a stark contrast to the cold she had just left behind. The interior was just as she remembered it, dimly lit, with worn wooden floors and long benches lining the walls. The community center had always been a little shabby, its age showing in the peeling paint and creaky floorboards, but to Elizabeth, it had always felt like home. She walked slowly through the space, her fingers trailing lightly over the familiar surfaces. The gymnasium was empty, the basketball court silent, the echo of past games still lingering in the air. She could almost hear the sound of laughter, the distant cheers of their friends as they had played pickup games here after school, their sneakers squeaking against the floor as they ran back and forth. But it wasn't just the games she remembered. It was the quiet moments, the hours spent sitting in the bleachers with Daniel, talking about everything and nothing. They had shared so many conversations here, their voices low and hushed as they talked about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. It had been a place where they could be vulnerable with each other, where they could let down the walls they kept up around everyone else. Elizabeth made her way to the far end of the gym, where the old equipment room was tucked away behind a set of heavy double doors. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the worn metal handle, before finally pulling the door open. Inside, the room was dark and cluttered, filled with boxes of old sports equipment and supplies. It smelled faintly of dust and leather, the scent instantly transporting her back to a time when she and Daniel had spent hours in here, rummaging through the old gear, laughing as they tried on oversized helmets and padded gloves. She walked slowly through the room, her fingers brushing against the shelves, the memories washing over her in waves. It was here, in this very room, that Daniel had first told her about his plans to leave town after graduation. He had been so excited back then, so full of ambition and drive, determined to make something of himself, to break free from the small town that had always felt too confining. Elizabeth remembered how proud she had been of him, how much she had admired his determination. But there had also been a part of her that had been terrified of what his leaving would mean for them, for the bond they had shared. She hadn't wanted to admit it at the time, but deep down, she had known that his leaving would change everything, and it had. After that conversation, their relationship had started to shift, the easy closeness they had once shared becoming strained. Daniel had thrown himself into his plans, focusing all his energy on preparing for the future, while Elizabeth had found herself struggling to keep up. She had tried to be supportive, had tried to understand, but there had been a growing distance between them, a distance that neither of them had been able to bridge. And then, of course, there had been that night under the Christmas tree, when everything had come to a head, when she had finally confessed her feelings, hoping that he would feel the same, only for him to pull away, to tell her that they couldn't be together. Elizabeth shook her head, pushing the memories aside as she stepped back out of the equipment room and into the gymnasium. The past felt heavy here, the weight of it pressing down on her as she walked, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to carry it all again. But at the same time, she couldn't deny the pull she felt, the sense that something unresolved still lingered between them. Seeing Daniel again had brought all those old feelings rushing back to the surface, and now, she was left wondering what to do with them. She wandered through the community center for a while longer, letting herself get lost in the memories. There was a certain comfort in being here, in revisiting the places that had once meant so much to her, even if the emotions they stirred up were complicated. Eventually, though, the weight of the past became too much, and Elizabeth knew it was time to leave. She stepped back outside into the cold, the sharp winter air hitting her with a sudden intensity. The sun had risen higher now, casting a soft glow over the snow, and the town seemed to be waking up, the streets slowly filling with people going about their day. As she walked back toward her parents' house, Elizabeth's mind was still swirling with thoughts of Daniel, of the life they had once shared and the life they might have had if things had been different. But as much as she wanted to dwell on the past, she knew she couldn't stay there forever. The past was just that, past. And while it had shaped who she was, it didn't have to define her future. Still, as she walked, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder what might happen if she gave Daniel another chance. If they both gave each other a chance to finally finish what had been left unfinished all those years ago. The thought lingered with her as she made her way home, the snow crunching softly underfoot, the twinkling lights of the town casting a gentle glow over the world around her. This Christmas felt different. Something was shifting, something was changing, and Elizabeth couldn't help but feel that, whatever it was only just beginning. Chapter 7. The Ghost of Decisions. The day passed slowly, as if the very clock on the wall of Elizabeth's childhood home had slowed its ticking. Outside, the world remained blanketed in snow, the town quiet and untouched by the frantic rush of the city she had grown accustomed to. In the stillness of the day, time seemed irrelevant, and yet Elizabeth could feel its weight pressing down on her, the past and the present colliding in a way that left her feeling untethered. By late afternoon, the house was still empty, her parents off visiting friends. The solitude felt comforting in some ways, but also unnerving. The silence gave her too much space to think, too much room for the memories of Daniel to flood back into her mind. It was as if the town itself was a constant reminder of him, every familiar place pulling her back to a time when their lives had been intertwined. After pacing through the house for what felt like hours, Elizabeth decided she couldn't stay cooped up any longer. She needed to get out, to clear her head, to escape the thick fog of memory that seemed to settle over her whenever she was indoors. She grabbed her coat from the rack by the door, pulling it on with a sense of purpose, though she had no particular destination in mind. The cold hit her as soon as she stepped outside, the chill cutting through the layers of her clothing and biting at her skin. The streets were quiet, only a few cars passing by on the slushy roads. The town was serene in its blanket of snow, but beneath that stillness, Elizabeth could feel a kind of restlessness growing inside her. She began to walk, her boots crunching in the snow as she made her way down the familiar streets. The holiday decorations still hung from lampposts and windows, a reminder that Christmas was only days away. But the festive cheer felt distant, like a scene she was observing from the outside rather than something she was a part of. Her feet carried her through the town square, past the bakery where she had spent so many afternoons as a teenager, sipping hot chocolate with her friends. The scent of fresh bread and pastries wafted out into the cold air, mingling with the smell of pine from the Christmas tree that stood tall in the center of the square. She paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the large tree, its branches heavy with ornaments and twinkling lights. The sight of it stirred something inside her, a sense of nostalgia so strong it almost hurt. That Christmas, 10 years ago, had been the last one she had spent here, the last one she had spent with Daniel before everything had changed. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold air sting her cheeks and pull her out of her thoughts. She had to stop dwelling on the past, but it was hard, especially here, where every corner of the town seemed to hold a piece of the life she had once known. With a deep breath, she turned away from the square and continued walking, her pace quickening as if she could outrun the memories chasing her. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but her feet seemed to know, guiding her toward the outskirts of town, toward the place she had been avoiding since her return. The woods loomed ahead of her, the tall trees dark against the snow-covered ground. The path that led into the forest was barely visible, hidden beneath the fresh snow, but Elizabeth knew it by heart. She had walked this path so many times as a teenager, sometimes with Daniel, sometimes alone. It had been their escape, their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves without the weight of the world pressing down on them. She hesitated at the edge of the trees, her breath rising in soft clouds as she stood there, staring into the shadows of the forest. The trees were bare now, their branches stripped of leaves, and the forest floor was blanketed in snow, untouched and pristine. It was beautiful in a stark, almost haunting way, but it was also full of memories. Memories that she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. But something inside her pushed her forward, and before she knew it, she was stepping onto the path, her boots sinking into the snow as she made her way into the woods. The air was colder here, the trees blocking out what little warmth the sun had to offer, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional crunch of snow underfoot. As she walked deeper into the forest, the memories came flooding back. She could almost see herself and Daniel, younger and full of hope, walking side by side along this very path. They had spent entire afternoons here, exploring the trails, climbing trees, and laughing until their sides ached. It had been their place, the one part of the world that had felt entirely their own. But as much as the forest had been a place of happiness, it had also been the setting for some of the hardest moments of their friendship. It was here, in the heart of the woods, that they had their first real argument, the one that had set the course for everything that followed. Elizabeth could still remember that day with painful clarity. They had been 17, just a few months away from graduation, and Daniel had been talking nonstop about his plans for college, about all the things he wanted to do once he left town. She had listened, of course, like she always did. But that day, something had shifted inside her. For the first time, she had felt a growing sense of dread, a fear that once he left, he would forget about her, that she would just be another part of his past, another piece of this small town he was so eager to leave behind. And so, she had told him. She had blurted out her fears, her insecurities, all the things she had kept bottled up inside for so long. She had expected him to reassure her, to tell her that nothing would change between them, that he would always come back for her. But he hadn't. Instead, he had looked at her with an expression she hadn't been able to read, his face a mixture of confusion and something else, something darker. That was when he had told her the truth, that he couldn't promise anything, that he didn't know what the future held, and that it wasn't fair for either of them to hold on to something that might not survive the distance. He had been kind about it, careful with his words, but the message had been clear. He was leaving, and she wasn't part of his plans. Elizabeth had felt her heart break in that moment, but she hadn't let him see it. She had put on a brave face, told him she understood, that she supported him, even though every word felt like a lie. And then, after that day, things had changed between them. They had still been friends, of course, but there had been a distance, a wall that neither of them had been able to break through. She had always wondered what would have happened if she had fought harder, if she had told him how she really felt, if she had made him stay. But she hadn't. And now, 10 years later, she was left with the same questions, the same regrets. As she walked deeper into the forest, the weight of those memories grew heavier. The path ahead of her was narrow and winding, the trees pressing in on either side, their bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The snow crunched softly underfoot, the only sound in the otherwise silent woods. Eventually, she reached the clearing, their clearing. It was a small, open space in the middle of the forest, surrounded by trees on all sides. The ground was covered in a thick layer of snow, undisturbed and pristine, and the air was still, almost eerily so. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching in her throat as she looked around. This place had been their secret, the one spot in the woods where they had always come to escape from everything. It was here that they had shared their hopes and dreams, their fears and insecurities. It was here that they had grown up together, their friendship evolving into something deeper, something neither of them had been able to fully understand at the time. She stepped into the clearing, her boots sinking into the snow as she made her way to the center. The air was colder here, the wind cutting through her coat and biting at her skin, but she didn't mind. The cold was a welcome distraction from the emotions swirling inside her. Standing there, in the middle of the clearing, Elizabeth felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. She had spent so many years running from it, trying to forget the way things had ended between them, but now, it felt like she was standing at the crossroads of her life. She wasn't sure what would happen if she reached out to Daniel again, wasn't sure if he even wanted to reconnect, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for them. Maybe the future they had once imagined together was still within reach. As she stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the woods, Elizabeth made a decision. She couldn't change the past, but she could choose how to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take that step. Chapter 8. A Light in the Distance. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke to the sound of soft, steady snowfall outside her window. The gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting the room in a muted glow. Her body felt heavy, the lingering weight of yesterday's emotions still pressing down on her, but she forced herself to get up. She couldn't stay in bed, wrapped in the familiar comfort of her childhood room. Not today. Pulling on a thick sweater and her favorite jeans, she made her way downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet, her parents still fast asleep, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt as though she were the only person in the world. She moved through the familiar space on autopilot, making herself a cup of coffee and staring out the window as the snow fell in soft, thick flakes, adding another layer to the already heavy blanket of white outside. The stillness of the morning was almost surreal. It felt like the entire world had been paused, frozen in place, while she stood there, caught in a web of memories and emotions she hadn't been able to untangle. She had made a decision yesterday, standing in that clearing, and now the weight of it sat heavy on her chest. Elizabeth took her coffee and went to sit by the window in the living room, curling up in her mother's favorite armchair. The Christmas tree twinkled softly in the corner, its lights casting a warm, golden glow across the room. She watched the snow fall outside, the way it fell in lazy spirals, drifting gently to the ground like confetti from a forgotten celebration. For the past few days, she had felt like a stranger in her own life, caught between the person she had been 10 years ago and the woman she had become. But seeing Daniel again had ripped open old wounds she hadn't even realized were still there. The unresolved tension between them hung over her like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. She had spent years trying to convince herself that what they'd had back then was nothing more than a teenage infatuation, a fleeting connection that hadn't been strong enough to survive the passage of time. But now, with Daniel back in her life, however briefly, it was clear that her feelings for him hadn't faded. If anything, they had only grown more complicated. Elizabeth sighed, setting her mug down on the table beside her. She had never been good at letting go of things. Memories, people, places, they all lingered in her mind, like ghosts that refused to be forgotten. And Daniel was the ghost that haunted her most of all. His absence had left a hollow space inside her that no one else had ever been able to fill. She had tried to move on, to forget him, but it had always felt like a part of her heart was missing. The snow outside continued to fall, the quiet rhythmic sound soothing in a way. But Elizabeth felt anything but calm. She had spent so many years convincing herself that their relationship had ended for a reason, that it had been better for both of them to go their separate ways. But now, that certainty was crumbling. She thought back to the way he had looked at her when they had run into each other at the cafe, the way his eyes had softened, just for a moment, before the walls had gone up again. There had been something unspoken in that look, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he felt the same way she did, that despite everything, he had never truly let go either. The thought made her heart ache, a dull, persistent throb that she couldn't ignore. What if they had made a mistake all those years ago? What if the reasons that had kept them apart no longer mattered? The questions circled in her mind, each one tugging at her in a different direction. She stood up, unable to sit still any longer, and paced around the room, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to move forward from here. The easy thing would be to walk away again, to let the past stay buried and pretend that seeing Daniel hadn't changed anything. But the truth was it had. Seeing him had shaken her to her core, had stirred up emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Elizabeth paused by the Christmas tree, her fingers brushing lightly against one of the ornaments. It was a small, delicate glass angel, one that her mother had always insisted on hanging in the same spot every year, right in the center of the tree. As a child, Elizabeth had loved that angel. It had always seemed so perfect, so ethereal, like it was watching over them, protecting their family from the troubles of the world. Now, as she looked at it, the angel seemed fragile, its wings shimmering in the soft glow of the lights. She felt a pang of something, loss, maybe, or regret. She had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself, trying to keep her heart safe from the kind of pain she had felt when Daniel had left. But in doing so, she had built walls around herself, walls that had kept everyone out. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected. She had spent 10 years running from the past, from the pain of losing Daniel, but in doing so, she had also run from herself. She had never allowed herself to fully confront those feelings, to grieve for what had been lost. And now, standing here in her childhood home, surrounded by memories of a life she had left behind, she realized that maybe it was time to stop running. The snow outside continued to fall, and as she stood there, watching it, a sense of calm settled over her. She didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the story of her and Daniel wasn't over. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them to find their way back to each other. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. But more than anything, it gave her a sense of purpose, a direction she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what she would say to him when they saw each other again, if they saw each other again, but she knew she couldn't let the opportunity slip away. Not this time. Elizabeth spent the rest of the morning walking through the house, letting her thoughts settle. The weight of the decision she had made yesterday in the woods still lingered, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a challenge. She had been afraid of confronting her feelings for so long, but now she was ready to face them. As the day wore on, the light outside began to fade, and the snowstorm intensified. By late afternoon, the town was blanketed in a thick layer of white, the streets almost completely empty. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and Elizabeth found herself pacing by the window, watching as the world outside was swallowed by the snow. The hours seemed to blur together, each one passing in a haze of quiet contemplation. She thought about Daniel, about their time together, about the way he had always been able to make her laugh, even when things were hard. She thought about the way he had looked at her that day under the Christmas tree, the sadness in his eyes when he had told her they couldn't be together. And she thought about the future, about what it might look like if they could find a way to be together again. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, Elizabeth allowed herself to imagine a life with Daniel, to picture what it might be like to wake up next to him every morning, to build a life together. As the snow continued to fall outside, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it. Whatever happened between her and Daniel, she had to face it head-on. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to wait, to see what the future would bring. The snowstorm raged on outside, the wind howling through the trees and the snow piling up against the windows. But inside the house, Elizabeth felt a strange calm. She had spent so many years running, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 9. The Call of Fate. The morning came with a brightness that felt at odds with the storm that had raged the night before. Elizabeth woke to sunlight spilling across her bed, the snow outside glittering beneath a clear sky. It was a strange contrast, the silence of the world blanketed in white, with the warm, golden light that made everything seem softer, more alive. It was the kind of morning that should have filled her with peace, but instead, Elizabeth felt a quiet restlessness gnawing at her. She had spent the past few days tangled in thoughts of the past, of Daniel, of what might have been. But now, with the sunlight streaming in through the window, she felt a new kind of urgency, a need to do something, anything, to break free from the inertia that had gripped her since she had returned home. Elizabeth climbed out of bed and dressed quickly, pulling on a thick sweater and a pair of boots before heading downstairs. Her parents were already awake, moving about the kitchen, preparing breakfast. The familiar sounds of the house, a spoon clinking against a bowl, the hum of the coffee maker, settled around her like a comforting embrace, but they did little to quiet the buzzing in her mind. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and slipped out into the cold morning air, her breath rising in small, frosty clouds as she stepped out onto the porch. The world was still, the only sounds the faint crunch of snow beneath her boots and the occasional creak of a tree branch weighed down by ice. The storm had left the town draped in a thick, sparkling layer of snow, untouched and pristine. Elizabeth took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sharp, cold air, and began to walk. She didn't know where she was going, but that didn't matter. She needed to move, to clear her head, to figure out what came next. The streets were mostly empty, the townspeople still inside their homes, no doubt recovering from the blizzard. But the solitude didn't bother her. In fact, she welcomed it. It gave her time to think, to let her thoughts unravel without the distractions of conversation or the noise of daily life. As she walked through the quiet streets, her mind drifted back to the last time she had seen Daniel, to that brief, unexpected moment in the cafe. The look in his eyes had stayed with her, lingering in her mind like an echo, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them in that brief encounter. It was as if the past had resurfaced, demanding to be acknowledged, to be dealt with once and for all. And now, as she wandered through the snow-covered streets of her childhood town, Elizabeth knew that she couldn't run from it any longer. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Her feet carried her toward the park at the edge of town, the same park where she and Daniel had spent countless afternoons as teenagers. It was a place filled with memories, both good and bad, and as she walked toward the entrance, Elizabeth felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread building inside her. The park was deserted, the playground empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. The snow lay thick on the ground, untouched by footprints, and the trees stood tall and bare, their branches reaching up toward the pale winter sky. It was a beautiful sight, peaceful and serene, but it also felt heavy with the weight of the past. Elizabeth walked slowly through the park, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. She remembered the way she and Daniel used to race each other to the top of the hill, the sound of their laughter filling the air as they collapsed in the grass, breathless and happy. She remembered the afternoons they had spent talking about their dreams, about all the things they wanted to do with their lives. They had been so full of hope, so sure that the future would be bright and full of possibilities. But life had a way of derailing even the best-laid plans. Daniel had left, and she had stayed behind, and the dreams they had once shared had crumbled into dust. Elizabeth reached the top of the hill and stopped, staring out at the view below. The town stretched out before her, the rooftops covered in snow, the streets winding through the landscape like veins in the earth. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt distant, like a place she no longer belonged to. She stood there for a long time, her thoughts drifting back to Daniel, to the last time they had spoken all those years ago. She had been so young, so full of emotion, and she hadn't understood why he had made the decision he had. She had thought it was because he didn't care about her, that he was ready to move on without her. But now, with the clarity that only time could bring, Elizabeth realized that it had been more complicated than that. Daniel had been afraid. Afraid of what their relationship might become, afraid of hurting her, afraid of holding her back. He had wanted to protect her, to spare her the pain of a long-distance relationship that might not have survived the pressures of time and distance. And in doing so, he had broken both their hearts. Elizabeth felt a pang of sadness as she thought about how different things might have been if they had made different choices, if they had fought for each other instead of letting fear and uncertainty drive them apart. But the past was the past, and there was no changing it. All she could do now was figure out how to move forward. As she stood there, staring out at the town, Elizabeth realized that she couldn't keep avoiding Daniel. She had spent the past few days trying to make sense of her feelings, trying to decide what she wanted. And now, standing here in the park where they had shared so many memories, she knew what she had to do. She had to talk to him. The thought sent a jolt of nervous energy through her, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose. She couldn't keep living in the past, couldn't keep running from her feelings. It was time to confront them, to confront him, and to figure out if there was still something worth salvaging between them. Elizabeth turned and made her way back down the hill, her steps quick and determined. The air was cold against her skin, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts tumbling over one another as she tried to figure out what she would say to Daniel when she saw him. Would he even want to talk to her? Or had he moved on, leaving the past behind him as easily as he had left their town? The thought made her stomach twist, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't let fear stop her. Not this time. She had spent too many years avoiding the truth, and now it was time to face it, no matter what happened. By the time Elizabeth reached the edge of the park, the sun had risen higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the town. The snow glittered in the sunlight, the world around her bright and alive. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. She knew what she had to do, and nothing was going to stop her. As she walked back through the quiet streets, her heart pounding in her chest, Elizabeth couldn't help but feel that she was on the verge of something big, something life-changing. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it. The sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets, and Elizabeth quickened her pace. Each step brought her closer to the moment she had been avoiding for years, and yet, she felt more alive than she had in a long time. The world around her sparkled with possibility, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth allowed herself to hope. Chapter 10. A glimpse of the past. The days that followed Elizabeth's decision to confront her past seemed to blur together in a flurry of activity and anticipation. Each morning she woke with a sense of urgency, as though she could almost see the threads of her life being woven into a new pattern. She was consumed by a singular thought. She needed to find Daniel. But finding him amidst the festive chaos of Christmas preparations proved to be more challenging than she had anticipated. Elizabeth spent the first few days trying to track down Daniel's whereabouts. She reached out to mutual acquaintances, scoured social media, and even visited places they had frequented together, hoping to catch a glimpse of him or, at the very least, some hint of where he might be. The search felt both exhilarating and exhausting. The uncertainty of not knowing where he was adding to the pressure she felt. On the fourth day after her decision, Elizabeth found herself walking down Main Street, the heart of her small town. The street was bustling with holiday shoppers, the sidewalks lined with festive decorations and twinkling lights. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, Elizabeth's thoughts were consumed by Daniel, her mind racing with the possibilities of what their reunion might entail. As she walked, she passed by the local bookstore, a quaint, charming place that had been one of their favorite haunts as teenagers. The store was decorated with garlands of holly and strings of colorful lights, and through the large window, Elizabeth could see the warm glow of the interior. An impulse led her to step inside, hoping that perhaps someone there might have information about Daniel. The bookstore was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the soft rustle of pages being turned. Elizabeth made her way through the narrow aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines of books as she scanned the room. She had always loved this place, loved the way it felt like a sanctuary from the outside world, a haven of stories and quiet contemplation. She approached the counter, where a young woman with dark hair and glasses was arranging a display of holiday-themed books. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before speaking to her, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked if she knew where she might find Daniel. The woman behind the counter looked at Elizabeth with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. After a moment, she shook her head gently, her expression apologetic. Elizabeth thanked her and turned to leave, her heart sinking. It seemed that even the familiar places of her past held no answers for her. As she walked out of the bookstore, Elizabeth felt a pang of frustration. The search for Daniel was proving more difficult than she had imagined, but she refused to let it deter her. Determined to continue her quest, she decided to visit the town's community center, a place that often hosted events and gatherings. Perhaps, she thought, there might be some information about Daniel there. The community center was bustling with activity, the walls adorned with colorful banners and holiday decorations. Inside, tables were set up for various activities, craft stations, bake sales, and a small stage for local performances. Elizabeth moved through the crowd, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of Daniel or someone who might know where he was. She approached a table where a group of volunteers was working on holiday crafts. They were busy cutting out paper snowflakes and decorating cookies, their hands moving quickly as they chatted amiably. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before approaching them, hoping that someone might have seen Daniel recently. The volunteers looked up as she approached, their faces friendly and welcoming. Elizabeth asked if they had any information about Daniel, and after a moment of discussion, one of the volunteers mentioned that Daniel had been a regular at the community center years ago, but they hadn't seen him recently. Elizabeth's heart sank again, but she thanked them and continued her search. As the day wore on, Elizabeth found herself wandering through the town's various landmarks, each place stirring up its own set of memories. She visited the old high school, the park where she and Daniel had spent countless hours, and even the local diner where they used to share milkshakes and fries. Each visit was tinged with a mix of nostalgia and longing, and each time, she left with a renewed sense of determination to find him. By evening, Elizabeth was exhausted. The sun had set, and the town was illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights and holiday decorations. She made her way back to her parents' home, her steps heavy with the weight of the day's fruitless search. The house was quiet when she arrived, her parents having gone out for the evening to attend a local Christmas party. Elizabeth took a deep breath and settled into the cozy living room, the warmth of the fireplace a stark contrast to the chill she had felt all day. As she sat there, Elizabeth's mind wandered back to the Christmases she had spent in this house, to the days when everything had seemed so much simpler. She could almost hear the echoes of her laughter and Daniel's voice, the memories intertwining with the present in a bittersweet dance. She glanced at the mantel, where her parents had displayed an assortment of family photos and holiday decorations. Among them was a framed photograph of her and Daniel, taken during their teenage years. They were standing together in front of the Christmas tree, their faces alight with joy. Elizabeth picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the outline of the photograph. The sight of Daniel's smiling face brought a fresh wave of emotions: hope, regret, and a deep, abiding love. Elizabeth knew that she had to find him, to confront the past and see if there was a chance to build something new together. She couldn't let the memories of their shared past be the only thing she had left. With a renewed sense of determination, Elizabeth set aside the photograph and began to formulate a plan. She decided to visit the places they had once frequented, to see if she could find any clues or hints about where Daniel might be. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. The following day, Elizabeth resumed her search with a fresh resolve. She visited the local cafe again, hoping to catch sight of Daniel or someone who might have seen him recently. She spoke with the barista, who remembered Daniel and mentioned that he had been a regular customer but hadn't been around for a while. Elizabeth's search continued, leading her to a local art gallery where she had once attended an exhibit with Daniel. The gallery was hosting a holiday show, and Elizabeth hoped that the familiar setting might offer some clue about Daniel's whereabouts. She wandered through the exhibit, admiring the artwork and talking to the staff, but once again, she came up empty-handed. As the days passed, Elizabeth began to feel the weight of her search. The holiday festivities continued around her, but they felt hollow and distant. She struggled to stay hopeful, to maintain the sense of purpose that had driven her to find Daniel. Each day was a mix of hope and frustration, and each night, she found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she would ever find him. Then, one cold winter morning, as Elizabeth was walking through a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, she spotted a small, familiar storefront that she hadn't seen in years. It was an old bookshop, a cozy, charming place that had once been a favorite of both her and Daniel. The shop had closed down years ago, but the windows were still decorated with holiday cheer, and there was a new, under new management sign posted on the door. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible that someone connected to Daniel might be here? She approached the shop, her breath misting in the cold air, and opened the door with a sense of cautious optimism. Inside, the bookshop was warm and inviting, the air filled with the scent of old books and fresh coffee. The new owner, a middle-aged man with a kind face, greeted her with a smile. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before asking if he had any information about Daniel. The man looked thoughtful, then nodded, mentioning that Daniel had visited the shop a few times before it had closed, but he hadn't seen him in a long time. As Elizabeth left the bookshop, her mind raced with possibilities. She had been searching for so long, and now, after all her efforts, she had finally found a lead. The bookshop had once been a significant part of her and Daniel's life, and it felt like a sign, a glimmer of hope in the midst of her search. Elizabeth made her way back to her parents' home with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the search for Daniel was far from over, but she felt closer than ever to finding him. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but she was determined to see it through. to find the man who had once been the center of her world. As she walked through the snowy streets, the soft glow of the holiday lights reflecting off the snow, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of connection to her past and a newfound hope for the future. She was on the verge of something important, and she could feel it in every step she took. With each passing day, the anticipation grew, and Elizabeth knew that she was getting closer to the moment she had been waiting for. The search for Daniel had become more than just a quest to find him. It had become a journey of self-discovery, a chance to confront her past and to embrace the possibility of a new beginning. Chapter 11. The Echoes of Time. The days after Elizabeth's visit to the old bookshop were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Her heart, which had once been weighed down by the uncertainty of her search, now beat with a steady rhythm of hope. The bookshop had been a significant find, a hint of familiarity in her quest for Daniel. The new lead it provided was both promising and daunting, as it suggested that Daniel might still be in town, or at least had some connection to it. Elizabeth spent the next few days visiting the local library and community bulletin boards, hoping to find any further clues about Daniel's whereabouts. The library, with its quiet reading rooms and rows of books, offered a sanctuary from the frenzy of holiday preparations. It was here that Elizabeth immersed herself in local news archives and old community newsletters, searching for any mention of Daniel. The library's archives were a treasure trove of information, and as Elizabeth flipped through the brittle pages of old newspapers, she uncovered snippets of the past that brought back memories of her and Daniel's time together. The old articles chronicled the town's events, from holiday fairs to school functions, and occasionally mentioned Daniel in connection with community activities. One afternoon, as she pored over a particularly old newspaper, Elizabeth came across a small article announcing a local art exhibition. It was a significant find because the exhibition had been held in the same art gallery she had visited earlier. The article mentioned Daniel as a volunteer, which meant he had been involved with the gallery during that time. This new piece of information gave her a sense of direction, reinforcing her hope that he might still be connected to the town in some way. The following day, Elizabeth returned to the art gallery with renewed determination. The exhibition had been a major event in the town's cultural calendar, and the gallery had since undergone renovations, but the memory of that time lingered. She hoped to find someone who might remember Daniel or have any information about him. Inside the gallery, the walls were adorned with new art, and the space felt vibrant and alive. Elizabeth spoke with the gallery's current staff, explaining her search for Daniel. While the staff members were unfamiliar with him, one of them mentioned that the gallery had maintained a registry of past volunteers and contributors. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat at the mention of a registry, and she eagerly asked if she could review it. The staff member led her to a small office in the back of the gallery, where the old registry was kept. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened the dusty ledger, flipping through its pages filled with names and dates. After several minutes of scanning, she found Daniel's name listed among the volunteers. The entry was dated several years ago, just before the gallery had undergone its last major renovation. The discovery of Daniel's name in the registry was both thrilling and bittersweet. It confirmed that he had been a part of the gallery's community, but it also left her wondering where he might be now. Elizabeth thanked the staff member and left the gallery, feeling both encouraged and anxious about the next steps. As the days continued, Elizabeth's search led her to revisit old haunts and community spots. She went back to the cafe, hoping to catch sight of Daniel or hear any new information from the staff. The cafe was bustling with holiday cheer, and she spent time chatting with the employees, subtly inquiring about Daniel. Elizabeth also reached out to old friends and acquaintances from her school days, asking if they had any information about Daniel. Some were able to provide snippets of gossip or rumors, while others had little to offer. Despite the varied responses, each conversation provided Elizabeth with a sense of connection to her past and a reminder of the tight-knit community she had once been a part of. In the evenings, Elizabeth returned home to her parents' house, where she would often sit by the fireplace, reflecting on her day. The crackling of the fire and the warmth of the room provided a comforting backdrop for her thoughts. She would take out the old photograph of her and Daniel from the mantel, studying it with a mixture of nostalgia and longing. The image of their younger selves, full of hope and excitement, served as a constant reminder of the connection they had shared. The holiday season continued its merry course, with the town bustling with festive activities. Elizabeth attended a few local events, including a holiday market and a charity auction, hoping that Daniel might be among the crowd. The events were lively and filled with holiday spirit, but Daniel remained elusive. One particularly snowy evening, as Elizabeth walked through the town square, she spotted a familiar figure in the distance. Her heart raced as she approached, hoping against hope that it might be Daniel. The figure turned out to be a former classmate, someone she hadn't seen in years. They exchanged pleasantries and caught up briefly, but the classmate had no new information about Daniel. As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth's determination never wavered. She continued her search with the same fervor, visiting every possible lead and following up on any clue that came her way. Her persistence began to pay off when she received a phone call from a local friend who mentioned having seen Daniel at a recent town meeting. The friend offered to introduce Elizabeth to a mutual acquaintance who might have more information. Elizabeth met with the acquaintance, an elderly gentleman who had been active in local community events for decades. He remembered Daniel from his days volunteering at the art gallery and mentioned that Daniel had moved away for a while but had recently returned to town. The news was both exciting and overwhelming, as it meant that Daniel might still be close, yet it left her wondering where exactly he was now. Following the lead, Elizabeth visited a few more places where Daniel was known to frequent, including local businesses and community centers. Each visit brought new information, and slowly but surely, she began to piece together a picture of where Daniel might be. One crisp winter morning, Elizabeth received a tip from a local librarian who remembered Daniel from when he used to visit the library regularly. The librarian mentioned that Daniel had been working on a project related to local history and had spent a significant amount of time at a nearby historical society. Elizabeth's heart soared at the prospect of this new lead and decided to pay a visit to the historical society. The historical society was housed in a charming old building at the edge of town. Elizabeth arrived and was greeted by a friendly staff member who informed her that Daniel had indeed been involved with the society, working on various projects related to the town's history. The staff member provided her with a contact number for Daniel, and Elizabeth's heart pounded with excitement as she took the information. With the contact number in hand, Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before dialing. The call was answered by a warm and friendly voice, and Elizabeth introduced herself, explaining her search for Daniel. The voice on the other end of the line responded positively, and Elizabeth was informed that Daniel would be at the Historical Society the following day. The anticipation that filled Elizabeth's heart as she hung up the phone was indescribable. She had come so far in her search, and now, finally, she was on the brink of finding Daniel. The journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had led her to this moment of possibility. The next day, Elizabeth arrived at the Historical Society early, her nerves a bundle of excitement and trepidation. The building was quiet, its halls lined with exhibits and artifacts that spoke of the town's rich history. Elizabeth wandered through the exhibits, her thoughts focused on the upcoming meeting with Daniel. Finally, the door to the society's office opened, and Elizabeth saw a familiar figure walking toward her. It was Daniel. Time seemed to stand still as their eyes met, and the world outside seemed to fade away. The years of separation and uncertainty melted into the moment, and all that remained was the connection they had once shared. Elizabeth and Daniel stood there, their hearts racing, as the echoes of their past converged in the present. The journey that had begun with a simple decision had brought them to this pivotal moment, and as they faced each other, they knew that the path forward was filled with both promise and uncertainty. The chapter closed with the promise of new beginnings, as Elizabeth and Daniel stood on the threshold of their shared past and the possibility of a future yet to be written. Chapter 12. Rekindling the Flame. The meeting at the Historical Society marked a turning point in Elizabeth's journey, a moment of convergence between the past and the present. As she walked through the grand old building, her heart was a tumult of anticipation and apprehension. The soft echo of her footsteps on the polished wooden floors felt almost rhythmic, guiding her toward the room where Daniel was expected to arrive. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation with both her past and her future. The Historical Society was housed in a stately building with large, arched windows that let in streams of natural light. The sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor and bathing the exhibits in a warm, golden hue. Elizabeth wandered through the main hall, her gaze drifting over the various artifacts and exhibits that told the story of the town's rich history. The exhibits were lovingly curated, each display a testament to the people and events that had shaped the community. As Elizabeth made her way to the office area where she would meet Daniel, she was struck by the juxtaposition of the historical artifacts and her own personal journey. The Society's displays, with their carefully preserved relics and old photographs, seemed to reflect her own desire to preserve and understand the past. She felt a deep connection to the stories around her, stories of people who had lived and loved, experienced joy and hardship, much like her own life. The office area of the Historical Society was a cozy space, filled with old maps, research materials, and historical documents. It had an air of quiet diligence, the kind of place where people devoted their time to preserving the past for future generations. Elizabeth took a moment to compose herself before the anticipated meeting with Daniel. She adjusted her coat, took a deep breath, and looked around the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of memories and emotions. Daniel's arrival was heralded by the sound of the door opening, followed by the soft murmur of footsteps. Elizabeth turned, her heart leaping into her throat as she saw him enter the room. He looked older than she remembered, the passage of time etched into his features, but his presence was unmistakable. The years had changed him, but there was still something profoundly familiar about him, a sense of recognition that bridged the gap between their past and present. Daniel's eyes met hers, and the recognition was instant. It was as if the years of separation had vanished in that single, electric moment. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around them as they stood there, taking in the reality of their reunion. The space was filled with a quiet intensity, the air thick with unspoken words and emotions. Elizabeth and Daniel stood across from each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. The room, with its walls lined with historical documents and old maps, seemed to serve as a backdrop to their personal narrative. The artifacts around them, maps detailing the town's evolution, old photographs of its past residents, and documents chronicling significant events, felt like silent witnesses to the moment unfolding. As they stood there, Elizabeth's mind drifted back to their teenage years, to the days spent in the town they both loved. She remembered their walks through the park, the conversations they had shared about their dreams and aspirations. Those moments had felt so significant at the time, and now, standing in this room with Daniel, they took on a new layer of meaning. The Historical Society's documents and exhibits seemed to mirror the complexity of their own story. Just as the Society preserved the town's history, Elizabeth and Daniel were faced with the task of revisiting and understanding their own past. The artifacts around them, each telling a different story, seemed to reflect the myriad experiences that had shaped their lives. Elizabeth watched as Daniel moved around the office, his actions deliberate and thoughtful. He picked up a historical document and examined it, as though seeking solace or understanding in the familiar work he had been involved with. The sight of him so engaged in his work brought back a flood of memories, reminding Elizabeth of the passion and dedication that had always characterized Daniel's approach to life. The office, with its warm, inviting atmosphere, became a sanctuary for their reunion. The soft light filtering through the windows, the quiet hum of the Historical Society's activities, and the presence of the artifacts all contributed to a sense of intimacy and reflection. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their story to unfold. Elizabeth and Daniel moved through the office, their interactions marked by a sense of quiet understanding. They exchanged glances, their eyes speaking the words that their voices could not yet articulate. The Historical Society, with its rich tapestry of the town's past, served as a backdrop to their personal journey, a journey that had brought them back together after years of separation. As they navigated the space, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice the changes in Daniel. The passage of time had left its mark on him, but there was still a spark of the person she had known. His demeanor was calm and thoughtful, and there was a certain ease to his movements that spoke of a man who had found his place in the world, despite the challenges he had faced. The historical documents and artifacts around them seemed to echo the themes of their own story: resilience, change, and the passage of time. Elizabeth thought about the years they had spent apart, the paths they had taken, and the lives they had lived. The journey to find Daniel had been long and filled with obstacles, but it had also been a journey of self-discovery and growth. As the afternoon wore on, Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves seated at a small table in the office, surrounded by the artifacts and documents that had been a part of Daniel's work. The table was covered with papers, old photographs, and research materials, each item a testament to the town's rich history. Elizabeth glanced at the documents, her thoughts drifting back to the reasons why they had come together in this moment. Daniel began to speak, his voice soft and reflective. Although there were no words exchanged, the air was filled with the unspoken understanding of their shared past. They were both aware of the significance of this meeting, the chance to confront their history and explore the possibilities of a future together. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elizabeth and Daniel explored the depths of their emotions and memories. The Historical Society, with its collection of relics and documents, became a metaphor for their own journey, a journey of rediscovery and reconciliation. The artifacts around them served as a reminder of the passage of time and the enduring nature of their connection. As the day drew to a close, the light in the room began to fade, casting long shadows on the walls. The warmth of the office and the quiet hum of the Historical Society's activities created a cocoon of intimacy and reflection. Elizabeth and Daniel sat together, their hearts and minds aligned as they navigated the complexities of their reunion. Elizabeth's gaze fell on an old map displayed on the wall, a map that showed the evolution of the town over the years. The map was a visual representation of change and continuity, much like their own lives. It served as a reminder of the journey they had undertaken and the possibilities that lay ahead. As the final rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves wrapped in a sense of quiet understanding. The Historical Society, with its rich tapestry of the town's past, had provided the backdrop for their reunion. It was a place where their personal story intersected with the broader narrative of their community, creating a unique and meaningful connection. The chapter closed with a sense of resolution and possibility. Elizabeth and Daniel had come full circle, their journey bringing them back to the place where it had all begun. The Historical Society, with its collection of artifacts and documents, had served as a witness to their reunion, a testament to the enduring nature of their connection and the promise of a new beginning. As they prepared to leave the Historical Society, Elizabeth and Daniel exchanged a final, knowing glance. The room, once filled with the echoes of their past, now held the promise of a future yet to be written. The journey that had brought them back together had been long and filled with challenges, but it had also opened the door to new possibilities and the chance to rekindle the flame of their shared history. Chapter 13. Unspoken Bonds. The days that followed Elizabeth and Daniel's meeting at the Historical Society were a blur of emotion and introspection. The reunion, marked by its deep significance, left both of them grappling with the weight of their shared history and the potential of their future. Each moment spent together was an exploration of their past, an unraveling of the complexities that had shaped their lives apart and the connection that had remained steadfast despite the years. Elizabeth found herself caught between a sense of nostalgia and a burgeoning hope for the future. The Historical Society had served as a poignant backdrop for their reunion, its artifacts and documents resonating with their personal story. The juxtaposition of the town's history with their own journey added a layer of depth to their encounter, making it clear that their shared past was an integral part of the present. As they navigated their way through the days following their reunion, Elizabeth and Daniel spent time together in various settings, revisiting old haunts and exploring new ones. Their interactions were marked by a silent understanding, a bond that transcended words. They wandered through the town streets, their movements fluid and comfortable, as though they had never been apart. The familiarity between them was palpable, each glance and gesture conveying the emotions that words could not fully capture. One crisp winter morning, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to visit the town park, a place that held a special significance in their shared history. The park, blanketed in a layer of snow, looked like a scene from a holiday postcard. The trees were adorned with icicles, and the frozen pond, once a place of joyful ice skating and shared laughter, now lay still and serene under the winter sky. As they walked through the park, Elizabeth and Daniel took in the beauty of the winter landscape. The park had always been a symbol of their carefree days together, and its current tranquil state mirrored the calm that had settled between them. The silence of the park was soothing, broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional call of a winter bird. Elizabeth paused by the pond, her gaze fixed on the frozen surface. Memories of past winters, of laughter, shared dreams, and whispered secrets, flooded back with vivid clarity. She glanced at Daniel, who stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the same sense of nostalgia. The connection between them was unspoken yet profound, a testament to the depth of their bond. They continued their walk through the park, each step a journey through their shared memories. The playground, now quiet and still, was a reminder of their younger days, when their lives were filled with the simplicity of childhood and the promise of the future. Elizabeth and Daniel stopped at the swings, the once familiar creak of the chains now a distant echo. They sat down, the motion of the swings gentle and rhythmic, their movements in sync as they reminisced in their own quiet way. The park had been a haven for them during their formative years, a place where they had built their dreams and shared their hopes. As they sat there, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of connection and possibility. The park, with its serene beauty and its echoes of their past, served as a bridge between their history and the future they were beginning to imagine together. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Elizabeth and Daniel made their way back to the town's main street. The festive lights that adorned the shops and buildings created a warm, inviting atmosphere, and the air was filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. The holiday season, with its spirit of renewal and joy, seemed to mirror the transformation taking place in their own lives. They wandered through the town's holiday market, a bustling hub of activity filled with vendors selling handmade crafts, seasonal treats, and festive decorations. The market was alive with the sounds of holiday music and the laughter of children, creating a sense of communal celebration that resonated with Elizabeth and Daniel. They strolled through the market, taking in the sights and sounds, their presence blending seamlessly with the festive spirit around them. At a small stall adorned with twinkling lights, Elizabeth and Daniel paused to admire the handmade ornaments on display. The stall's owner, an elderly woman with a warm smile, welcomed them with a nod. Elizabeth picked up an ornament shaped like a snowflake, its intricate design catching the light. The snowflake, delicate and beautiful, seemed to symbolize the unique and fragile nature of their own connection. Daniel watched as Elizabeth examined the ornament, a soft smile playing on his lips. There was a sense of contentment and peace in his demeanor, a reflection of the newfound clarity that had emerged from their reunion. The ornament, like their relationship, was a symbol of something precious and enduring, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in the midst of life's uncertainties. As they continued their exploration of the market, Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves drawn to a small cafe tucked away in a corner. The cafe, with its cozy ambience and inviting aroma, offered a refuge from the cold. They entered and found a quiet corner table where they settled in to enjoy a warm drink and continue their silent conversation. The cafe's interior was adorned with festive decorations, creating a warm and welcoming environment. The soft glow of the lights, the rich aroma of coffee and pastries, and the gentle hum of conversation created a comforting atmosphere. Elizabeth and Daniel sipped their drinks, their thoughts intertwined as they reflected on their journey and the possibilities that lay ahead. The cafe, with its sense of intimacy and warmth, provided a fitting backdrop for their continued exploration of their relationship. It was a place where they could be themselves, where the pressures of the outside world melted away, and where they could focus on the connection that had brought them back together. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth and Daniel left the cafe and made their way back to the town square. The holiday lights twinkled overhead, casting a magical glow over the snow-covered streets. The town, with its festive decorations and cheerful atmosphere, felt like a place of renewal and hope, mirroring the emotions that had surfaced during their time together. Elizabeth and Daniel walked through the square, their presence a blend of quiet reflection and newfound optimism. The square, with its festive decorations and holiday spirit, served as a reminder of the possibilities that lay ahead. The town's transformation into a winter wonderland was a fitting metaphor for the changes taking place in their own lives. As they reached the edge of the square, Elizabeth and Daniel paused to take in the view. The town, with its festive lights and snow-covered streets, looked like a scene from a dream. The beauty of the moment, combined with the warmth of their connection, created a sense of fulfillment and contentment. In the stillness of the evening, Elizabeth and Daniel stood side by side, their hearts full of the unspoken bonds that had brought them together. The journey that had led them to this moment was marked by its own set of challenges and triumphs, but it had ultimately led them to a place of understanding and hope. The chapter closed with a sense of quiet satisfaction and the promise of what was to come. Elizabeth and Daniel had come full circle, their journey of rediscovery and connection leading them to a place where their shared history and their future possibilities could coexist. The town's festive spirit, with its message of renewal and joy, served as a fitting backdrop for their own unfolding story, a reminder that even in the midst of life's uncertainties, there was always the potential for new beginnings and lasting happiness. Chapter 14. A Winter's Tale. The arrival of January brought a crisp clarity to the town, the new year heralded by a blanket of fresh snow that covered the landscape in serene whiteness. The festive lights that had adorned the streets during the holidays were taken down, but the charm of winter remained. The town, now quieter and more reflective, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the new beginnings that the year promised. Elizabeth and Daniel, having rekindled their connection, continued to navigate the nuances of their renewed relationship. The days spent together in the town's familiar surroundings had deepened their bond, as they embraced both the simplicity of their shared history and the complexity of their present circumstances. Each day felt like a new chapter in their story, a journey of rediscovery and understanding. One particularly frosty morning, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to explore the town's countryside, seeking solace in the natural beauty that lay beyond the familiar streets. They bundled up in warm clothing, the cold air biting at their cheeks as they ventured out into the winter landscape. The countryside, with its rolling hills and snow-covered fields, offered a sense of tranquility and a chance to escape the bustle of daily life. As they walked along a winding path, the snow crunched underfoot, each step creating a soft rhythm that echoed through the stillness of the countryside. The landscape stretched out before them, a pristine expanse of white that seemed to go on forever. The trees, their branches laden with snow, formed a canopy of delicate frost, creating a sense of enclosure and intimacy. Elizabeth and Daniel followed the path, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The countryside was a stark contrast to the town's holiday hustle, offering a peaceful retreat where they could reflect on their journey and the future that lay ahead. The simplicity of the landscape mirrored the simplicity of their connection, reminding them of the profound beauty found in the most ordinary moments. As they walked, Elizabeth and Daniel came across a small, frozen pond nestled among the trees. The pond, with its icy surface shimmering in the sunlight, was a picturesque scene of winter's splendor. Elizabeth paused at the edge of the pond, her gaze fixed on the frozen water. The pond had been a place of joy in their childhood, a site of ice skating and shared laughter. Its current stillness was a reminder of the passage of time and the changes that had come since those days. Daniel joined Elizabeth at the pond, his presence a reassuring anchor as they took in the scene. The memories of their time at the pond, of the carefree days spent skating and talking, flooded back with vivid clarity. The pond, now quiet and serene, seemed to hold the echoes of their past, a silent witness to their journey. They continued their walk, eventually reaching a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding countryside. The hill was blanketed in snow, and the view from its summit was breathtaking. The landscape stretched out before them, a patchwork of white fields and dark, snow-laden trees. The sky, a crisp, clear blue, provided a stark contrast to the snowy ground, creating a scene of serene beauty. Elizabeth and Daniel stood at the top of the hill, their eyes taking in the vast expanse before them. The view was a reminder of the endless possibilities that lay ahead, a canvas upon which they could write their own story. The quiet of the countryside, combined with the beauty of the landscape, created a sense of peace and possibility. As they made their way back down the hill, Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The winter landscape, with its stillness and beauty, seemed to echo their own sense of renewal and hope. The time spent together in the countryside had provided a moment of clarity, allowing them to see their connection in a new light. Back in the town, life continued its steady rhythm. The quiet of winter was interspersed with the occasional burst of activity as the townspeople went about their daily routines. The town's charm remained, even in the absence of the holiday decorations, and the sense of community and connection was palpable. Elizabeth and Daniel spent their days exploring the town, visiting local spots that had been a part of their shared history. They revisited their favorite cafe, where they had spent so many hours talking and dreaming. The cafe, now a warm refuge from the winter chill, provided a cozy setting for their continued exploration of their relationship. They also visited the town's library, where Elizabeth had spent countless hours searching for information about Daniel. The library, with its quiet reading rooms and rows of books, offered a sanctuary for reflection and discovery. Elizabeth and Daniel spent time perusing the shelves, their shared love of books and history creating a bond that extended beyond their personal connection. The town's historical society continued to be a place of significance for them. The documents and artifacts they had explored together served as a reminder of the town's rich history and their own journey. The historical society, with its dedication to preserving the past, became a metaphor for their own efforts to understand and embrace their shared history. As winter progressed, Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves increasingly immersed in the rhythms of their daily lives. Their relationship, marked by its quiet understanding and mutual respect, continued to deepen. The time they spent together, whether exploring the countryside or engaging in everyday activities, reinforced the connection that had brought them back together. One evening, as the sun set and the town was bathed in the soft glow of twilight, Elizabeth and Daniel walked through the streets, their footsteps echoing softly in the quiet of the winter evening. The town, with its snow-covered rooftops and warmly lit windows, looked like a scene from a storybook. The sense of peace and contentment that had settled between them was mirrored in the serene beauty of the town. They reached the town square, where the last of the holiday lights had been taken down but the spirit of the season lingered. The square was quiet, the only sounds the soft rustling of the snow and the distant murmur of conversation. Elizabeth and Daniel paused at the edge of the square, taking in the scene. The chapter closed with Elizabeth and Daniel standing together in the town square, their hearts full of the unspoken bonds that had brought them back together. The winter landscape, with its beauty and tranquility, served as a fitting backdrop for their ongoing journey. The promise of the new year, with its potential for renewal and growth, mirrored the possibilities that lay ahead for them. In the quiet of the evening, as they stood side by side, Elizabeth and Daniel felt a sense of completion and anticipation. The journey that had led them to this moment was marked by its own set of challenges and triumphs, but it had ultimately brought them to a place of understanding and hope. The Winter's Tale, with its themes of renewal and possibility, offered a glimpse into the future they could build together, a future filled with the promise of new beginnings and lasting happiness. Chapter 15: Crossroads of the Heart. As February arrived, the landscape continued to be draped in winter's embrace, but the subtle signs of an impending change were beginning to stir. The days were growing longer, and the occasional thaw in the snow hinted at the arrival of spring, though it was still a distant promise. The town, with its quiet streets and snow-covered rooftops, seemed to be in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the next chapter in its seasonal cycle. Elizabeth and Daniel, now deeply connected and more attuned to each other than ever before, faced a turning point in their journey together. Their time spent exploring the town and countryside had strengthened their bond, but it also brought to light the complexities that lay ahead. Their shared history, filled with both joy and heartache, was now juxtaposed with the reality of their present and the uncertain future. One chilly afternoon, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to visit the old bridge that spanned the river at the edge of town. The bridge, with its weathered stone and ironwork, had been a part of their childhood, a place where they had spent many hours talking, dreaming, and planning for the future. It was a site of significance, a physical reminder of their past and the changes that had occurred since then. The bridge, with its arches and flowing river beneath, stood as a silent sentinel over the passage of time. The river, partially frozen with patches of open water, flowed steadily beneath, its surface reflecting the gray sky. Elizabeth and Daniel stood on the bridge, their gaze fixed on the river's undulating current, which seemed to mirror the flow of their own lives. The bridge offered a vantage point that allowed them to see both the town and the surrounding countryside. From this elevated position, the familiar landscape appeared both comforting and distant, a representation of the life they had shared and the paths they might choose to follow. The bridge became a metaphor for their own crossroads, a place where they could pause and reflect on the choices before them. As they stood there, the weight of their situation began to settle in. Elizabeth and Daniel had built a strong connection, but the question of their future together loomed large. The passage of time, with its inevitable changes and challenges, had left them at a point where decisions had to be made. The bridge, with its timeless presence, seemed to hold the answers they sought, but those answers were not yet clear. They spent several hours on the bridge, their thoughts intertwined as they contemplated the choices before them. The river's flow, steady and unrelenting, served as a reminder of the need for action and decision. The bridge, with its connection between the past and the present, became a symbol of the journey they had undertaken and the path that lay ahead. As the afternoon gave way to evening, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to return to the town. The sun, low on the horizon, cast a warm, golden light over the landscape, creating long shadows that stretched across the snow-covered ground. The transition from day to night was marked by a sense of quiet reflection as the town prepared for the coming darkness. Back in the town, the evening was marked by a sense of calm. The streets, illuminated by streetlights, were bathed in a soft, ambient glow. Elizabeth and Daniel walked through the quiet streets, their footsteps muffled by the snow. The town's tranquility provided a fitting backdrop for their continued contemplation of their future. They made their way to a small, secluded park on the edge of town. The park, with its snow-covered benches and frosted trees, offered a serene setting for further reflection. They sat on a bench, the cold air nipping at their cheeks, but the warmth of their shared presence providing comfort. The park, with its gentle beauty and quiet ambience, became a place of solace and introspection. Elizabeth and Daniel sat together, their thoughts focused on the future and the decisions they had to make. The park's tranquility offered a contrast to the complexities of their situation, providing a moment of peace in the midst of their uncertainty. As they sat there, the night deepened, and the park became a landscape of shadows and muted colors. The snow, illuminated by the soft light of the street lamps, created a magical atmosphere that seemed to envelop them. The quiet of the night, combined with the beauty of the park, provided a sense of clarity and calm. Elizabeth and Daniel remained in the park for a long time, their thoughts reflecting on their journey and the choices that lay ahead. The park's serene environment served as a backdrop to their introspection, allowing them to consider their options and the direction they wanted to take. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth and Daniel returned to their respective homes, their hearts and minds filled with the weight of their decisions. The bridge and the park, with their symbolism and significance, had provided them with the space to reflect on their past, their present, and their future. The choices they faced were daunting, but the clarity they had gained from their time together offered hope and direction. The chapter closed with a sense of anticipation and resolve. Elizabeth and Daniel had reached a crossroads in their relationship, a point where decisions had to be made about their future together. The journey that had brought them to this moment was marked by its own set of challenges and triumphs, but it had ultimately led them to a place of understanding and possibility. The winter landscape, with its beauty and tranquility, provided a fitting backdrop for their ongoing journey, a reminder that even in the midst of uncertainty, there was always the potential for new beginnings and lasting happiness. Chapter 16. The Unspoken Promise. As the first hints of spring began to appear, the town underwent a subtle transformation. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of green and the early blossoms of crocuses and snowdrops. The air, once crisp and cold, now carried a promise of warmth and renewal. The transition from winter to spring mirrored the changes taking place in Elizabeth and Daniel's lives as they grappled with the decisions that lay ahead. In the weeks following their contemplative time on the bridge and in the park, Elizabeth and Daniel continued to navigate the complexities of their relationship. The growing light and the budding nature around them provided a backdrop of hope and new beginnings. but the process of making decisions about their future remained fraught with uncertainty. One Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to visit the town's botanical garden. The garden, which had been closed during the winter months, had recently reopened for the spring season. The prospect of vibrant flowers and lush greenery offered a sense of renewal and a fresh perspective on their journey. As they arrived at the garden, the sight that greeted them was a kaleidoscope of colors and fragrances. The garden, now in full bloom, was a riot of tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths, their vivid hues contrasting with the lingering remnants of winter. The air was filled with the sweet scent of flowers and the gentle hum of bees, creating a sensory feast that invigorated the soul. Elizabeth and Daniel wandered through the garden's pathways, their steps light and unhurried. The garden, with its carefully tended beds and winding trails, offered a serene escape from the complexities of their daily lives. They took in the sights and sounds, allowing the beauty of the garden to wash over them and provide a sense of calm and clarity. They paused by a serene pond at the center of the garden. The pond, surrounded by lush greenery and blooming water lilies, reflected the sky's soft blue and the garden's vibrant colors. The tranquil water and the gentle movement of fish beneath the surface created a peaceful ambience that was both soothing and inspiring. Elizabeth and Daniel sat by the pond, their presence blending seamlessly with the garden's tranquility. The pond's beauty and serenity offered a moment of reflection, allowing them to consider their feelings and the decisions they needed to make. The garden's renewal and vibrancy served as a metaphor for their own journey, a reminder that change and growth were integral parts of their path forward. As they continued to explore the garden, they came across a small, secluded area with a charming gazebo. The gazebo, adorned with climbing roses and wisteria, provided a picturesque setting for contemplation. Elizabeth and Daniel took a seat inside, the gazebo's wooden beams and floral decorations creating an intimate and inviting space. The time spent in the gazebo was marked by a sense of quiet introspection. Elizabeth and Daniel reflected on their journey, their shared history, and the future they envisioned. The gazebo, with its beauty and seclusion, offered a fitting environment for their thoughts and emotions, providing a sense of clarity and focus. The garden, with its blooming flowers and vibrant colors, continued to inspire and uplift them. The renewal of nature mirrored the renewal in their own lives, and the beauty of the garden provided a sense of hope and possibility. Elizabeth and Daniel felt a renewed sense of connection as they considered the potential for new beginnings and the promise of a shared future. As the afternoon waned, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to take one last stroll through the garden before heading home. The sun, now lower in the sky, cast a warm, golden light over the landscape, creating a magical glow that enhanced the garden's beauty. The gentle light, combined with the garden's vibrant colors and fragrances, created a sense of wonder and possibility. They walked hand in hand, their steps in sync as they took in the garden's final sights. The transition from winter to spring was complete, and the garden's transformation served as a reminder of the potential for change and growth in their own lives. The sense of renewal and hope that had emerged during their time in the garden offered a new perspective on their journey. Back in the town, the signs of spring continued to unfold. The snow had melted, and the streets were lined with budding trees and blooming flowers. The town's transformation mirrored the changes taking place in Elizabeth and Daniel's lives, providing a backdrop of renewal and possibility. Elizabeth and Daniel spent the following days in a state of quiet anticipation, their hearts and minds focused on the future. The time they had spent together in the botanical garden had provided them with a renewed sense of clarity and hope. They continued to navigate their relationship, their decisions guided by the promise of new beginnings and the potential for a shared future. One evening, as they walked through the town streets, they noticed the gradual transition of the town's seasonal decorations. The winter decorations had been replaced with spring-themed adornments, including pastel-colored banners and floral arrangements. The town's transformation was a reflection of their own journey, marking the beginning of a new chapter. Elizabeth and Daniel found themselves drawn to a small park at the edge of town. The park, with its open green spaces and blooming flowers, provided a peaceful setting for their continued reflection. They sat on a bench, the soft grass beneath them and the gentle breeze carrying the scent of spring. As they sat together, The quiet of the evening provided a sense of calm and introspection. The park's beauty and serenity created an environment conducive to contemplation, allowing them to focus on their feelings and the decisions they needed to make. The chapter closed with Elizabeth and Daniel sitting side by side in the park, their hearts filled with the promise of new beginnings. The beauty of the spring landscape and the sense of renewal it represented offered a hopeful outlook on their future. The journey that had brought them to this moment was marked by its own set of challenges and triumphs, but it had ultimately led them to a place of understanding and possibility. The transition from winter to spring, with its themes of renewal and growth, served as a fitting backdrop for their ongoing journey. Elizabeth and Daniel faced the future with a renewed sense of hope and anticipation, ready to embrace the potential of a shared life and the promise of lasting happiness. Chapter 17. A New Dawn. The arrival of March brought with it a palpable shift in the atmosphere of the town. The once dormant landscape, still marked by the remnants of winter, now began to stir with the early signs of spring. The days grew noticeably longer, and the sun, more assertive, began to melt away the last vestiges of snow, revealing a world eager for renewal. Elizabeth and Daniel, having traversed the emotional and temporal landscapes of their shared history, found themselves on the cusp of a new chapter. The clarity and hope they had gained from their recent experiences had crystallized into a resolute sense of purpose. Their time in the botanical garden, the serene moments by the pond, and the tranquil beauty of the park had all contributed to a profound understanding of their path forward. The town, transformed by the seasons, mirrored their own journey. The streets, once blanketed in snow, were now adorned with the colors of spring. Trees budded with fresh leaves, and flowers began to bloom, painting the landscape with vibrant hues. The town's renewal was a reflection of the transformation occurring within Elizabeth and Daniel's lives. One crisp morning, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to revisit the old bridge, the same bridge where they had confronted their crossroads a few months earlier. The bridge, now surrounded by the budding greenery of early spring, seemed to symbolize their journey from winter's introspection to the promise of new beginnings. As they approached the bridge, the soft morning light filtered through the emerging leaves, casting a gentle glow over the landscape. The river, no longer completely frozen, flowed with renewed vigor, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky and the burgeoning foliage. The bridge, with its familiar arches and enduring presence, stood as a testament to the passage of time and the enduring nature of their connection. Elizabeth and Daniel stood on the bridge, their gaze fixed on the flowing river below. The sight of the river, moving steadily forward, served as a metaphor for their own journey. The river's continuous flow, unimpeded by the obstacles it encountered, mirrored the path they had chosen to take. They spent several hours on the bridge, allowing the serene environment to envelop them. The sounds of the river, combined with the gentle rustling of the leaves, created a soothing backdrop for their reflections. The bridge, with its connection between past and present, provided a space for them to contemplate the future they envisioned. As they stood there, the significance of their journey became increasingly clear. The time they had spent together, the challenges they had faced, and the growth they had experienced had all contributed to a deeper understanding of their relationship. The bridge, as a symbol of connection and transition, offered a fitting backdrop for the decisions they were about to make. Eventually, Elizabeth and Daniel decided to leave the bridge and take a walk through the town. The streets, now vibrant with the colors of spring, provided a lively contrast to the serene beauty of the bridge. The town, with its bustling energy and renewed vitality, was a reflection of the hope and possibility that filled their hearts. They wandered through the town's marketplace, where vendors displayed their fresh produce and handmade crafts. The market, with its lively atmosphere and colorful stalls, was a celebration of the season's bounty. Elizabeth and Daniel took in the sights and sounds, allowing the vibrant energy of the marketplace to further inspire them. As they walked, they came across a small, charming cafe that had recently reopened for the spring season. The cafe, with its inviting outdoor seating and blooming window boxes, offered a cozy retreat from the bustling market. Elizabeth and Daniel decided to stop for a moment of respite, enjoying the warm atmosphere and the simple pleasures of a shared cup of coffee. The cafe provided a moment of reflection and connection. As they sat together, surrounded by the warmth of the cafe and the buzz of the market just outside, they considered the future that lay ahead. The sense of renewal and possibility that had emerged during their time in the botanical garden and on the bridge was now reinforced by the vibrant energy of the town and the cafe's welcoming ambience. After their time in the cafe, Elizabeth and Daniel continued their walk through the town, their steps in sync as they explored the streets and parks. The beauty of the spring landscape, combined with the renewed vitality of the town, created a sense of optimism and hope. The season's transformation was a fitting backdrop for their own journey, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. As the afternoon turned to evening, Elizabeth and Daniel made their way to a hill on the outskirts of town. The hill, with its panoramic view of the landscape, offered a perfect vantage point to take in the beauty of the setting sun. The sky, painted with shades of pink and orange, provided a breathtaking canvas that enhanced the tranquility of the moment. They stood on the hill, their gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun dipped below the horizon. The beauty of the sunset, combined with the serene landscape, created a moment of profound clarity and connection. The hill, with its expansive view, symbolized the boundless possibilities that lay ahead. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to appear, Elizabeth and Daniel took a deep breath, embracing the sense of completion and anticipation. The journey that had brought them to this point was marked by its own set of challenges and triumphs, but it had ultimately led them to a place of understanding and hope. The chapter closed with Elizabeth and Daniel standing together on the hill, their hearts full of the promise of new beginnings. The beauty of the spring landscape and the sense of renewal it represented offered a hopeful outlook on their future. The journey they had undertaken, marked by its moments of reflection and growth, had led them to a place where they could embrace the possibilities of a shared life and the promise of lasting happiness. In the quiet of the evening, as the stars twinkled in the sky and the town lay below them, Elizabeth and Daniel felt a deep sense of connection and resolve. The transition from winter to spring, with its themes of renewal and growth, provided a fitting conclusion to their journey. The new dawn that awaited them was filled with the promise of love, understanding, and the potential for a future built together.